All right, welcome to our webinar today. I have the privilege of being able to have a conversation with two great folks here. So my name is David Gray, and I'm with Project Equity. As you all know, we are a nonprofit leader in the area of employee ownership, and we're really focused on harnessing employee ownership to help communities to honor selling owners' values and their legacy and really address income and wealth inequality. And today we're having a conversation with you both, and I'll let you introduce yourselves in a second, because we want to talk about where employee ownership sits as a tool to address retention and acquisition of employees. So, Liza, can I have you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about
Yeah.
you?
Hi, I'm Liza Sanchez, and I am a recruiter. I am the owner of Eight Bridges Talent Partners, and I have worked with Project Equity and with Atthowe for quite some time, and a variety of other companies and nonprofits in the recruitment space. So I come at this from a lens of recruitment. So that's
Great. Brian, how about you? Can you share a little bit about
I'm
yourself?
Brian Kane. I'm the CEO of Atthowe Fine Arts Services, and yeah, we became a co-op in 2021 with the help of Project Equity, and we've also worked with Liza before, so this is a privilege. Thanks.
That's wonderful. And we'll get more into the nuances of all of these things. Just to kind of set kind of an idea of our framework today, what we're going to do is have a discussion, the three of us. We're going to kind of talk about how we've seen employee ownership impact the topic of the day. And then I'm going to have some space for some questions from the audience. And so if you are joining us today, please go ahead and put your comments in the chat, and we'll be able to address those at the end of that. We're looking at a great conversation here for the next 45 minutes or so. And I'd like to start by defining employee ownership first. So, employee ownership, as we really kind of think of it, is a broad-based employee ownership. And it's when a company has ownership where at least 30% of the ownership of the business is held by the employees. There's a lot of flexibility on how we structure that. There's some really common approaches like an ESOP, an employee ownership trust, worker co-ops. There's multiple approaches to it, and so it's very flexible in how it can address that. But that's kind of the framing that we're using today when we're thinking about broad-based employee ownership. Brian, you had alluded to the fact that you work at a business that is employee owned. So I'm wondering if you could kind of just start us off here with talking about how you first encountered employee ownership.
Sure. We were founded by Scott Atthowe somewhere in the 70s, depends on what. We don't know. Somewhere in the 70s. When he got to retirement age, he had always talked about selling the business to his employees. None of us really knew what that meant, including him. And he had researched ESOPs. He was pretty financially adept, and he didn't like them for so many reasons that don't really need to get into, but he didn't like them. So we found Project Equity, basically, and you guys helped us pick a structure that is employee-owned cooperative in California. And so we were also kind of ran headlong into the pandemic. We had gotten a PPP loan, so we had to wait because if you change ownership, all this kind of nonsense happened. So it was kind of from 2018 through 2021 that it took us to actually 2021 in January is when we became a cooperative.
Yeah.
And
Brian, I
five.
appreciate that you kind of landed your story in our history, meaning during COVID. And I was working during those years with a lot of businesses, as I know you were too. And those were tough times. And, we'll go through and we might be presently going through some other times and so that are challenging. And it's interesting to see that you all were able to convert to employee ownership in a time of upheaval and that it worked for you. But I'm wondering if you could, before we kind of broaden the conversation, can you tell me your own personal journey in terms of concerns you might have had about employee ownership or hopes that you might have had?
Uh, we have we range between 45 and 50 people employed. And
Yep.
I have been here since 1993. And so, and a lot of people have been here a long time. It was and still is a good place to work. So I was really concerned what was going to happen when Scott retired. And the range was from, he was actually never going to retire or let us run the place, to he was just going to leave. And we really didn't understand what was going to happen at all. And I had plan B. I talked to some other employees. We were trying to figure out if a group of us could buy the place, if, you know, if this cooperative thing didn't work out.
Right.
I'm fortunate and lucky to say we never had to even do that. Not even sure if we could have, but you know, it worked out. And it was really just somebody doing like a Google search that found you guys. That is literally it. And bringing in Hillary at the time, and
Yeah.
Hillary came in, and we were all like, oh, this is great. At least we're going to find out if we can actually do this. And then it dawns on you pretty quickly that you can't fix a broken company by becoming a co-op. Like you have to be running a well-run company, and we didn't have. So concurrently, we hired a management consultant because we didn't really have much management. We had an owner, and he managed everybody. So those two things really helped us kind of get through a difficult time, but also come out as a employee-owned cooperative with, I think we had almost 30 founding members.
Wow, that's exciting.
Yeah.
And I love how you alluded to management. I've been working in this field for years, and one of the first questions I always hear is, well, yeah, I think employee ownership's great for some businesses, but we need strong leadership in our industry. And I'm always like, yes, of course you do.
Yeah.
And one of the big kind of misconceptions I feel is out there with regard to employee ownership is that you don't have strong leadership. And so yeah, I see you, Brian, you're like, no, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it is, it is, right?
Yes, the
And so
leader.
one of the things that I often say to business owners is I say, like, you have figured out a business model. You've figured out how to run a really efficient machine. We don't want to change it if we move it towards employee ownership. The goal is to figure out how to continue to keep that leadership, that wisdom, that management structure in place, and that the ownership dynamic around employee ownership comes in as that board of directors at that high level governance piece. And it
Yep.
sounds like that's resonating with you.
Well,
So
yeah, it
yeah,
is.
please. What
And
was
well,
your
for me
thought there?
personally, you know, it's a board, right? The board directs the CEO.
Yep.
The beauty of it is it's a board full of employees. And when it works really well, you know, I don't feel fettered or stopped. I have the same responsibility that I would have if I owned it, or if I was talking to investors
Yep.
or whatever. But what I gain from the situation is a distinct lack of isolation, you know, because
Mhm.
a lot of CEOs they feel very isolated. It's a tough job. The buck does have to stop with you,
Yep.
but I feel like I have a real partnership with this board of directors. They've been in the trenches with me. We've been here a long time. I can go to them and say, I have a problem. What do you think? Or they can go to me and say, we have a governance issue. We think it's worth you doing. So it can work, maybe not as efficiently as if I just owned the place and could do whatever I wanted, but I think it's better. I really do think it's better.
Yeah, well, that's great. We can get more into it. But Brian, thank you for kind of giving us the touch and feel of employee ownership, because that's really what's the framework for the conversation we're going to have here today. And I'd like to open up, we've got a panel survey question that's going to pop up here, I believe. And the question is, this is for all of you that have joined us in our webinar today, but what are some of your top hiring and retention challenges? So hopefully you'll see that right there. You can go ahead and put your answer in. And then later on in our conversation, I'm going to refer back to some of these examples that we're getting from you participants, and we'll kind of pull those into our conversation. So please feel free to enter those in, and we'll be getting back to those later. Liza, I want to pivot to you. You've been doing recruiting for a long time. You've seen probably a couple different waves of anxiety, and we had that post-COVID years where it was everybody was trying to find employees right away. What are the top challenges you see right now with regard to acquisition?
Boy, it really depends on the sector
Mm. Oh,
and the
please give more.
role.
Yeah, yeah.
So there are certain roles that are just harder to fill. It also, the move towards remote work has become
Mm,
very attractive for employees with a strong preference. And I feel like a lot of employees don't actually prefer to be remote. They
mm,
just want the choice. Like
mm,
they probably, a lot of them choose to go to the office and hang out with the people, but they don't want to have to. So that's a big piece. Um, you know, I would say with the younger, newer working generation,
yeah.
those who are just graduating from college, graduate school, um, I think they're facing a much more difficult economic climate.
Hmm.
So, for example, they have a lot of student debt. The housing market is, nearly
Hmm.
impossible to support themselves
Hmm.
in health benefits. Like they have to have a job with health care. It's a really tough place for them. And salary salary and benefits are really, really important to people. And I do hear a lot of sort of disgruntled people saying, well, these young people, they're asking for so much, such a high salary. And I'm thinking, well, they probably have a lot of debt
Right.
and they're trying to support, themselves, where if you're older, you might be in a house that you've lived in for a long time, or you might own property, or you went to school at a time that wasn't quite as expensive as it is now, or you don't have debt. So, I do find the younger generation is much more anxious about salary, benefits,
Mm,
and even retirement kind of
mm.
situations, but needing to make sure they're earning well is really important. So
That's really helpful. When I reflect on my friends that are kind of in that kind of stage of life, I've also sensed from them that there's a desire to have meaningful connection to the work that they're doing. Is that something you're sensing as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm,
Yes. Yes. Because I would say that the only reason someone would take a pay cut is because they really have a strong belief in the work that they're doing, or they feel it's important, or they're passionate about it, or they love it. One of those pieces, if those things aren't in line, then they're like, I need the money.
right, right, right. Yeah,
But even that, it's not really that fulfilling. I do get a lot of people that are leaving sort of your traditional corporate jobs because they just don't feel fulfilled,
yeah,
even though they're like, I'm making a lot of money, but I just don't feel happy with what I'm doing.
yeah. Brian, let me pull you in as somebody who's running a business. Do
There's two
yeah,
thoughts that come into my head
give
right.
me your two thoughts, and then I got a follow-up question.
One, I I don't. Yeah, I'm of the older crowd, so I look at the younger people coming in here, and yeah, they're asking for a lot of money, but I think to myself, when I was their age, what would I need to get? Where are they going to be in 20 years? Like they're facing stuff that we never had to face. We could just have kids and get healthcare and get a job and change jobs and do all this stuff. And incrementally things would get better, right? Things would just get better because we weren't nearly as burdened as they are. And so, yeah, you kind of have to wipe your windshields clean of that kind of preconception that they just want the money. They're doing what everybody else does. They have to figure out where they're going to be in 20 years. And so my second thought is we work in the arts. So our pay scales aren't high compared to, we might do well compared to other arts companies, but compared to tech companies, we're like minuscule, right? So people aren't coming here to get rich. It's just not going to happen. So I really offer them longevity, and I offer them a culture. And a lot of people are looking for a culture and a place that they aligns with their values. They can come and feel like their values align with the company values, and then we're in it together and we'll do the best we can.
Let me peel the onion a bit there. What about being an employee-owned business do you feel is maybe attractive to folks that are recognizing they might take a little bit of a pay cut or something like that? So where do you, when you're at that final stage, you're doing kind of like you found a candidate you really like, you're offering them a position, and I've been there, you kind of want to put your best foot forward and you're like, you want to highlight the things that you can bring to them as a employer. How does employee ownership fit into that for you?
Well, for us, it's maybe a little different than some companies. We have a highly specialized business that's really mission centric.
Mm.
You're going to want to be here if you're from the arts, you want to work with the arts, you believe that the arts and culture is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with not being mission centric. Like, we need bakeries, we need factories, we need all sorts of things, and those are great jobs. But you're going to come here for this kind of purpose. Maybe it aligns with your interests. And so I can offer that whether I'm employee owned or not, right?
Mhm.
But there's two other parts to this. There's the financial part, which is ownership, and ownership is real. It's not some weird corporate promise. You have rights, you have obligations, you're an owner, you share in, it's real, it's ownership with all of it. And you have governance in our particular structure. There's also governance, which is agency. So you have some agency in what is going to happen with the company that you own a part of. You're not just some shareholder that doesn't have agency and hopes it goes well. Those are three things that I can bring to the table. And it also kind of, it's not a great place to come maybe if you want to be here for a couple of years and go somewhere else. I mean,
Mhm.
maybe it is, because if we can give you some good training. But in the mix of things, we really are looking for people who are going to stay here, who are going to, be here for, like me, like I'm here for 30 some years, and now I'm the CEO. Nobody ever thought that would happen. So
Yeah. No,
yeah, I
that's
hope that answers your question.
yeah, no, that really does. And I'm going to reframe what you just said in the way I usually talk about it. I talk about ownership really as being three key things. There's control. So there's some voice that is owners you're able to exert. So there's control. There's benefit, meaning there's the rewards of ownership. It could be profit sharing, it could be financial in these different ways. And then there's responsibility. And responsibility is really dealing with the risk that comes with ownership. And I sometimes think of a car. My son is 16 and that brings its own stuff, right? And if
Sure
he
it
owns a
does.
car, right? He owns a car. He's going to have control. He'll decide where to park it, decide if he wants to put new money into a stereo system, right? And then there's the benefit where he can like have that extra freedom where he can take it where he wants. He gets a little bit more like, hey, I can drive, an hour down the road if my parents let me. And then the third is there's that risk, the responsibility, right? If he gets in an accident, those types of things. And I think that ownership, as I've been working with companies from the beginning stages where I'm working with the owners to think about employee ownership, if it's a good fit for them, to the transition. And then the final kind of, we do a post conversion support where we walk with the business for 2 to 3 years, really helping them live into what does it mean to do ownership. I see these three different things of ownership really show up in different ways. And one of the ones that, and I'm going to get to this in a second, but one of the ones that was a surprise to me was pride. And that sense of being able to say, I work somewhere and I'm an owner.
Mhm.
And, like, have you heard of XYZ place? Well, I'm an owner there. That's where I work. Like, there's just this added pride. So I'd like to kind of peel into in that conversation a bit. But before we do that, Liz, I'm wondering if you could speak to this question as well. When you are trying to find people to fit roles with Brian's company, have you found employee ownership is attractive to folks? Does it set?
Oh, definitely.
Okay, tell me
Yeah.
about that. How does it
Yeah.
set it apart?
Well, so, when I was recruiting at Atthowe, they now have someone who's doing their own recruiting. But when I was doing it, they were in the process of transitioning. So they hadn't fully transitioned yet. This was right during the time when they had the operations consultant who brought me in, actually.
Mhm.
So, we discussed their needs, and so I always say that salary is the number one attractor to a
Yeah,
job.
yeah.
Mission, obviously, is going to be huge. But behind salary is benefits, and
Mm,
particularly, um, you know, the idea of being a part owner kind of lands in the benefit category, because in addition to
mhm.
maybe having a retirement account, there is this, hope that this company is going to do really well. And then as the company does well, you do well as an owner, right? You
Mhm.
are also reaping the rewards of being a part owner. So, and in addition to at How, I have other people who work where they have a sort of ownership structure. It's more like stock options.
Mhm.
Um, and they want to stay because they know that's going to be valuable for them to keep that and to get vested in that. So whatever ownership structure it is, there's a sense of commitment and
Yeah.
excitement, but also it's seen as a benefit. Like, wow, so when I was interviewing people, it wasn't wildly known that it was employee owned. But then I would discuss that with them, that this was a business that was converting to employee ownership. And that certainly was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. People
Mm,
were really excited about that concept. So
mhm,
it definitely was attractive in a
mm,
variety of ways. Um, and I think pride is a lot of that too. I
mm,
mean, certainly there's the thought that you will, make money as being an owner. If you're an owner,
mhm.
you're in it because you want to, you know, reap the benefits of the work you're putting in to a company.
Yeah.
But in addition, it's that, like you're saying, like you're actually not just a cog in the wheel. You're really part of that leadership, and it's exciting. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a story. Like, I oftentimes feel I've got the best job because I get to work with these businesses that they convert, and I work with the employee owners as they're kind of recognizing, hearing about the option to become an employee owner, and then living into it. But one of the clients I was working with, they were a cabling client, and they would put in cable, like they did construction type stuff, and they would put the cables in businesses. And one of the employee owners was looking at the specs, and they had always, and maybe I'm going to get too much into the weeds here, they always had a requirement to leave 2 inches of extra wire whenever they did a joint, when they were kind of connecting different wires. You can tell I'm not an expert in this, right? Like, my terminology is just really kind of layman's terminology. But after they became employee owned, this person came to their boss and they said, you know what? We don't need that extra like inch and a half. Let's cut it down to a half of an inch, and we could do that across the board. It's not going to change like our bidding for the jobs. It's just going to be additional profit that we are going to be able to make. And they were able to bring, I think it was an extra like 30K that they were able to save a year.
Big
But
wire.
but but right, like over the course, if you're an employee there and you're able to save that over like 2 years or 5 years, that's really going to impact folks with the profit sharing dynamic. And anyways, it kind of speaks to some of that benefit and agency that I think occurs. Um, Let me pivot our conversation a bit. I'd like to talk about retention. So we were talking a little bit already about making a job more attractive if there's employee ownership, but I'm wondering about retention. Brian, you've made a comment to us yesterday when we were talking before we got into this, and you said that now you're able to look over your employee base and you're starting to identify folks that you're like, I think they're going to retire here. And it was a bit of a my sense of when you shared that was this idea that you think that maybe people now, where they maybe would have just stayed for a shorter period of time, might see themselves staying longer. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what it is about employee ownership that you think enables employees to think of staying longer at a job where they might have in the past cycled out.
I was thinking about this because you had sent me notes and you were going to ask me about retention and what our challenges were. And there are some challenges that we had that had nothing to do with employee ownership. We had people at retirement age. That's always a challenge.
Yeah.
We have people who have children, so they're in the childcare age. That's always a challenge. You got to figure it out, you know. But I did think about what I said to you. And I think that the best thing you can do is create a culture. And you can't promise that everybody's going to rise to the top, because it doesn't really work like that. Like, not everybody's going to become a CEO or want to be the CEO, but you can promise a culture that is less exploitive. I mean, that's on the face of it, right?
Right.
You're not exploiting people for another set of people to become wealthy. And I always tell people, money doesn't go anywhere. It's here. It's all here.
Right.
The accounting is transparent, and transparency is something I get asked about a lot. There's a lot of mythology about cooperatives, like they vote on everything and you can see what everybody makes. And a lot of it's BS. Like,
Yep.
no, you can't see personnel files, and no, we don't vote on everything. But there is a transparency. Tomorrow night I'm going to report to the General Assembly. There's going to be 30 some people there who are owners, and I have to give them financials, and they're real financials. It's not BS, and none of it is money that goes to outside investors because we owe them. We're still paying our loan, but that's different. So I guess the best thing I can say is you retain people when you're telling them where they are. You're telling them why they're here, and they can attach to it however they need to. Some people are going to stay in the same job and rise up with seniority, and they don't want to become some other job, but some people do. But you're telling them all the time where you are, why you're here, what your values are, what the mission is. It's the best you can do, really.
Yeah. One of the things in our conversation yesterday, when the three of us were talking before today, we talked about this. There's a gap right now in research to know exactly how many people stay longer and how much longer. We at Project Equity, we're in our 11th year, and all of our clients, and I know, Brian, you guys do this, but all of our clients give us data every year. We are building a database so we can see the impact of employee ownership long term. But it takes time to build that up and to get all the data and be able to identify these trends. One of the trends I hear from owners, and I hear from like the employee owners, and I hear from the chairman of the boards or CEOs that I'm talking to of employee-owned businesses, is that their employees are staying significantly longer than they used to. But I don't have the hard data on that one yet, and we're building it. But Liza, I'm wondering if, with your lens of recruiting, if you could help us understand what you think might be happening, why employees would be staying longer at an employee-owned business.
Well, certainly we have sort of again, a younger, older population kind of thing going on. Whereas in my parents' generation, it was very common for people to get a job out of college and stay in that job until they retired. They didn't job hop, right? That wasn't really, it's just less common. Now, the general knowledge that young people share with each other is you're not going to grow and you're not going to get a raise if you stay in a company. Like, if you stay, the only way to increase your seniority or to increase your pay is to keep changing jobs, right? And often it's like every 2 to 3 years. And for companies, it's a huge cost.
Right.
because the cost of losing an employee that you have trained and worked with and supported, and then the cost to hire someone new is always a lot.
Yeah.
And every hire is a risk of, is this person going to work out? I mean, a really difficult employee can cost you also a lot of money. So you
Mhm.
really invest in your people. Um, and I know this is going on at a lot of organizations or companies where you've got this lot of turnover. And, how can you stop that?
Yeah.
And I think what Brian mentioned was this idea that you're committed and invested in it, not
Mhm.
just, you don't have to jump all over the place to, the work you put in is how the business is going to do,
Yep.
right? So if it, there's definitely a mentality of, we are creating this, we are, when we all work hard, the business grows and we
Yep.
do well, and that payout is real. And that's the motivation to grow, not like, I don't have to change jobs. I actually just have to give more to this job I have. So I think it's good for the company, and it's also prevents this like constant moving of people, which is also exhausting for the employee themselves.
Yep.
People don't necessarily want to do that. A lot of them are like, I left my company, I loved it, but I didn't have a future there. So
Right.
that's what I'm seeing. But
Oh, I
It's
love that. And it really sparked a memory. I was talking with some employee owners at a place that they kind of do assembly line work. And they were talking to me about the experience of it. And they're like, now that we're owners, I just throw the thing back to the guy in front of me if he doesn't do a good enough job. It's not like I'm just trying to like make my boss happy. It's like, no, we need to do this right so that we can get that profit at the end of the year. And it was such an interesting frame that it no longer, and Brian, I think this speaks to your point. It no longer is, oh, we're making more money for the owner. By doing a better job, we're making more money for ourselves.
yeah.
I do. I mean, we've lost a couple of people to tech companies
Mhm.
that could pay much more, and they both instances they had debt and children, and I don't blame them. They had to do what they had to do, and so you're going to be in the business world. You're competing with others, but you can just, like I say, you can just be clear about what you can offer, and people do. They do take pride in being here. I can definitely feel that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So, we're kind of we've been in having this wonderful conversation for about 30 minutes. I just want to remind folks if people have questions to please put them in the chat window. And one of those questions I think is really kind of on point for where we're at right now. So I'm going to bring that into this. So I have somebody that wrote, what are some of the specific examples of responsibility of ownership? What are some of the example duties of employees would be responsible for in an employee-owned company? Sorry, I don't have my glasses on. So, Brian, I think you and I can maybe speak to this a bit, but one of the things that I'm very aware of in this conversation is there are multiple approaches to employee ownership. I alluded to just a few of them earlier: ESOPs, employee ownership trust, worker co-ops, and I know, Brian, you're in a worker co-op, so it's got its own kind of flavor
Yes.
of employee ownership. But just from a broad perspective, I would say that some of the responsibilities of ownership are transparency around financial things. So there's usually at least a high level profit and loss statements, balance sheets, those kind of key documents that we use to understand the financial reality of a business are being shared with the broader employee ownership base. And with that, I know comes education, right? And so people start understanding how money flows through the business and those types of things. So part of the responsibility is understanding how the business model functions. One of the other dynamics I've seen in employee ownership is there's this governance role. And so oftentimes employees can run for the board of directors. There might be a couple seats on the board of directors that are made up of employee owners. And one of the things that's always interesting to me is if you look at the corporate world, once you start having a larger business, you've got shareholders, you already have a board of directors. And so we're not adding a new thing for the business world. We're just bringing kind of some of the best practices of board governance, and we're bringing that down to more mid-sized, smaller businesses. And so sitting on the board of directors is another example of the responsibility. The other thing I find is the responsibility for ownership is this idea of taking ownership in terms of the responsibility of the product. And I alluded to that earlier, where you've got the employee owners that can't just say, well, I'm just doing this for the owner, Joe, right? It's about myself. But Brian, what are some of the specific examples of responsibility you have seen at Atthowe that employees have stepped into?
So, well, there's a couple of ways to think about this. And to answer the question, maybe a little bit for whoever asked it, I mean, it's all about the bylaws. In our structure, it's about the bylaws, and the bylaws will say what your rights and your obligations are when you become a member. And we often talk about that, you know, you have an obligation to show up for the meetings. You have an obligation to vote. You don't have an obligation to run for the board. We sure would like it if you did. You know, but one thing I also talk about quite a lot is that if you sit on the board, you have fiduciary duty.
Mm-hmm.
That is not, that is no small thing, and it's not just a nice sounding weird word. It means you are responsible financially to make decisions that affect all the owners. So there's a real seriousness there, and it requires that the books are done right, that the reports are done right, that you can see financials, that they're, you know, and there's a whole, sometimes I like to say we have to run a business and we have to run a co-op. There's two things we have to run. You have to do them both well. But the co-op, if the board is really going to stand as my partner and have fiduciary responsibilities, they have to have financial education, so we're all talking the same language. We assigned a book.
Yep.
You know, you guys have training too, but we went a little farther with that because people, they don't really understand the balance sheet versus a P&L. Why should they? I mean, why should anybody, unless like love that stuff? But you really need to see what it is if you own a company.
Yeah.
And you know, and then of course you get kind of the downside of that is you're always dealing with the promise of control. Like, okay, I can control stuff. Well, no, you can't. But neither can a shareholder in, you know, name your big oil company. It's like you have agency.
Agency
and
and
you
voice,
can
yeah.
talk amongst yourselves, and you can decide like, well, okay, this is how we want to make our money. You know, it's worth doing XYZ. You know, when the greening committee says we can do this thing, but it's gonna cut into your profits. Hey, board of directors, you represent the owners. There's your balance. Green or money? Which kind of green do you want? And that means that I don't have to sit here alone and make decisions like that. We can talk amongst ourselves, and we can, you know, I'm an owner too, so yeah. But it is an obligation.
Yeah.
It's not just a piece of stock that you buy and you sit.
It almost sounds exactly like how any other company works. It's just that the profit doesn't go to the owner, it goes to the owner employees.
Yep.
Because most companies have, you know, boards that are there, and you have to listen to your employees, and you might not have a say, or you may have a say, but it doesn't sound that different from any other.
No, I don't think it is.
Small village, and you don't have to pay the king.
Exactly.
We're right. There are tax benefits as well. I don't want to. That's a whole nother webinar, so we'll do that.
I have a question, Brian, following up on that, and I know there's another question about pros and cons of current employees, but is it possible that you can have an employee at Atthowe who doesn't do anything besides their job? They are an owner, but they don't go to meetings or not on committees.
Ownership is not a requirement.
But if they are an owner, do they have to do other things as owners?
Yes, they have obligations.
Because,
they can lose their membership if they do not show up for meetings. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I
Enough.
think what I like about that example is it speaks to the various approaches to employee ownership. So under an employee ownership trust, there aren't those requirements. And so that's
Right.
why we work with businesses to help identify what is the right approach of employee ownership for you. And I think it gets to this question about pros and cons, but some employee groups really want that deep level of engagement and they want that responsibility thing. And so as we work on bylaws, I've worked with some companies that are like, you need to show up for your annual general meeting as a member at least once a year. And if you miss 2 years in a row, you might lose your membership.
Yeah.
And it's that idea that you need to be responsible. You need to carry that. And then I've got employee ownership trusts where they're like, you know what, that's just not realistic for our workforce that they're going to want to come
Right.
and add this extra kind of dynamic to their life. They'd rather just be an employee and also be able to see that, a little bit of insight, deeper insight into the how the business model functions, but also still be able to get the profit sharing. And so that's where I think that there are multiple approaches of employee ownership that are going to be right for whoever that is. And I'm just going to put a plug here because we are hosting here at Project Equity. You can go on our website, you can set up free consultations with our folks to be able to talk through these options with you. Anyways, I'll put that aside now. But
In
Brian,
response to that, it works for us to do it this way with a lot of governance because we're highly specialized. So we need our people to be highly trained and specialized and stay. And that quality control is really important. We handle high value stuff. We go into we deal with the 1% of the 1%, a lot of these collectors. We're in houses, we have NDAs that we sign. That ownership mentality is kind of important, that it just works for us to have a highly trained, highly specialized workforce that we retain. It's just the type of business we're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Um,
Liza? Yeah,
Oh,
looks like
I just keep seeing new questions come in, so I'm like, I want to make sure we get to them.
yeah, I know.
Before we move on to the one that just came in, cons. I mean, I'm imagining that one of the biggest cons, and Brian, I'm not sure if this is true, or David, from your experience, is that now you are a business owner,
Yeah.
and that is not easy, right? Like you're dealing with all the stress and the worries and the things that you would if you're a business owner. So I'm curious.
I've got an
Joke
example of
around
that.
here.
Brian, I'll let you jump in a second here. I'll never forget, I was working with an employee group and they were finalizing, deciding if they were going to buy the company for, like, there was a deal structure on the table. And one of the individuals said, boy, if we buy the business for this amount, it's going to keep me up at night. And one of the other potential employee owners was like, well, we can't do it. And I kind of chimed in there. I said, that's what ownership is. Like, I can't tell you how many owners stay up at night because they're worried about stuff. And there was like oh, yeah, you're right. That is what ownership is. And so I love what you picked up on there, that ownership carries that responsibility. And there are some cons. But Brian, it looked like you had some thoughts.
Oh, we have a joke around here. It was so easier when we could just blame Scott. Now it's like, oh crap, it's us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's one of the cons. I think another con can be maybe not a con, but a bit of a risk. I have found that when employee businesses convert to employee ownership, so like when a business converts to employee ownership, sometimes the employees come up with a lot of expectations about what it means. And so what we find that we spend the first 2 years of that post-conversion support on is helping understand what the expectations are for what voice means, what control means, and really focusing in on, and this gets to one of the other questions around the board of directors, helping the board of directors understand the separation between what is governance and what is management or operations. And knowing that the governance piece should not bleed into operations. You've got you've got a leadership structure that has been working well, that knows how to make the right decisions. They know how to, they're specialists in determining what the bids are for deals, right? Brian, when you guys are bidding for a contract, I'm sure you don't want the board of directors
Nope.
evaluating those bids. That would
No.
just be a mistake. And so part of what I think the risk is to ensure that the employee owners don't try to overstep what they should be focused on. And I continually say to folks, I'm just like, your primary goal, I want you to run a great employee owned business, but your primary goal is not figuring out the perfect governance. It's continuing to figure out the perfect business. Because if the business is running well, it's going to make everything else run well as well.
Mhm. Yeah, it's absolutely true.
Mm,
And you do, there's a lot of work to dispel mythologies of, of what a co-op is.
yeah,
And you just have to do the work. It's fine.
yeah, yeah.
There's a question here. What does the board of directors look like for a smaller company? I don't know how to answer that. You might.
Yeah, I do kind of. One of the things, there are a lot, and I feel like I keep saying the same thing. It's a spectrum of employee ownership, and there's kind of different vehicles. And if you have a business that has like 10 employees, the way the board of directors is going to function and look is very different than if you have a business of, say, 50 employees or 200, or even, in Spain, I think the largest worker co-op is tens of thousands of
Mm.
worker owners, right? And so each size creates its own needs and how it's functioning and how it structures. And I don't want to get too specific into kind of the nuances of a 10 employee business versus a 25. But I'm wondering, Liza, you've been hearing Brian and I kind of talk back and forth about this. What are you hearing in our conversation that stands out to you with your kind of lens as a recruiter?
Huh. Well, I think that the biggest challenge in the recruitment world when you're recruiting to employee owned is exactly what you said, David, which is a lot of people don't really understand
Mm,
employee ownership. So as you're recruiting into an employee owned business, like we're saying, there's so many different types, there's so many different structures, you have to do a lot of education of
yeah.
people coming in. Like
Mm-hmm.
very few people have worked in an employee-owned company before. I mean, and this is testament to the work that Project Equity is doing, which is to grow employee ownership. And, being in this space, I've definitely seen the explosion of employee ownership. When I first started working with Project Equity many years ago, there were only 6 people working there. And, you know, although it had its, there were people very committed to it. Now I feel like it's just jumped a lot. The amount of people I interview for roles who are already knowledgeable and aware of employee ownership has grown. But in terms of the corporate, sorry, there's a car alarm going off outside.
Oh, don't worry, it's filtering it out pretty well.
Okay, good. But yeah, in terms of, when you're hiring people into a employee ownership space,
Yeah.
often they don't really know what that means or what that's like, what it would mean to be an owner. So there you do have to do a little more education for that. That's kind of the piece
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I'm like picking up on, not as a negative. I mean, I
No.
think it's
Hmm.
a really great positive, and I think there's a lot of excitement around it. But as someone who's hiring, you're gonna have to explain the structure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We're running out of time here. Brian, I want to come back to you because I think you sit with a really unique perspective as being in leadership, being the leader of an employee-owned business, working with employees that reported to you before they were employee owners and now are reporting to you as employee owners. And I'm going to give a little bit of a story. So one of the things that happened for me, probably about 4 years ago, I was working with a group of employees that were moving towards employee ownership, and we were going into the P&L, profit and loss statements, balance sheets, and one of the individuals was like, "Why are we spending so much on paper products?" And it was a coffee shop. And the previous owner was sitting there and said, "Well, that's the coffee cups we spend that much on." And this person was like, they were a barista, and they were like, "My goodness, like I'm never gonna double cup a coffee cup again for a customer unless they ask for it." And it was this kind of like aha moment where I think the understanding the profit and loss statement, seeing kind of the annual cost for that one line item was like an eye-opening experience for them to say, "Hey, we need to reduce it." So Brian, I guess my question for you, and maybe this could be our last question unless something else pops in here. Um, how have you seen employees change now that they are employee owners and you've kind of been down this road for many years, are you finding a tangible difference in how employees are showing up at work?
Yeah, and I'm going to try and not be too long-winded. Like I said, I'm trying. For us, it's almost the opposite. The way our company was run before, it was extremely kind of, we used to call it a culture of scarcity. Like you never bought anything. You did, you know,
Mm.
you never, we did so much with so little, and
Yeah.
the owner was just really frugal,
Yeah.
really tight with money. And for myself, I had to kind of push through that and make people believe that we could actually buy this thing that we need and
Mhm.
charge more for being, you
Right.
know, there was a there was a lot of uh, understandable anxiety because we had just bought this place, we owed money. Now all of a sudden everybody wants to do everything differently. Everybody has an idea that it's going to cost us money, and it's my place to kind of say, yes, that's a good one. No, that's not a good one. Oh, let's wait on that one.
Yeah.
And there was just a lot of people that most of us we weren't really sure this was going to be okay. Like that we could actually pull this off.
Mhm.
And because our financial past is so kind of clouded with the entanglement of the personal wealth of the owner and the company, which most of them are, like
Yeah, exactly.
it's just this unbelievable disentanglement job. Um, you know, you just really need to keep your employees aware of what's happening at the same time, yeah, giving them agency, but at the same time you can't let go. You have to show that you're managing the situation.
Yeah.
um, so what I see is this shift to be able for the employees to be able to trust a system, because it showed itself to be profitable for 4 years. So now we can kind of like, because the first thing you're getting is like, it's just like you say, it's like, well, it's kind of the opposite. Like for us, there was like, well, maybe we shouldn't use so much tape. Tape's expensive, you know, like, okay, I'll use less tape. I'll think about it. But on the other hand, there's all these ideas about, well, you bought a new truck, so there goes our bonus.
Mm.
No, that's not how it works. That shows up on the balance sheet, not the P&L. We
Yeah.
amortize, and then everybody goes, "What the hell are you?" So now it's the other side of the coin. It's like, no, this is how you run a business that wants to be here for 20 years.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a rambling answer, but
No, I think that's helpful. And one of the things, and Liza, I'm just gonna let you kind of respond to this last comment I was gonna make. One of the things that I have found is that part of employee ownership is it gives employee owners a chance to do something outside of their job description, be it running on the board of directors or being on a finance committee or an HR committee. And I've wondered if it isn't an opportunity to allow people to maybe stay a couple years longer at a business because they have rewarding or new challenging things that maybe aren't, like if you're on a finance committee, you can kind of get your toes wet in the finance world and see like, oh, do I understand this? Do I like this? Is this a new thing for me? Um, as I'm wondering, maybe just as a wrap up, if you have any reflections on how that might appeal to kind of retaining business employees over the long run.
You know, I've never interviewed someone, and I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews, but I've never interviewed someone who said, there's only one little thing that I want to do in my life, and that's the only thing I want to do all day, every day. And a lot of people do love variety in
Yeah.
their day, in their, work. And the one thing that people absolutely love is feeling like they're growing and that they're learning. Um, I think being stagnated for too long in one sector, and people do get really pigeonholed into a job and a sector, and especially Brian, where you're so specialized. I mean,
Mhm.
there's someone who specifically specializes in framing or packaging paintings, right? Like
Yeah.
that's their specialty. And what an opportunity to get to do something else that's interesting or exciting. I've never, like, I absolutely think that people are always excited when they get to learn and grow. Even sometimes people who think that's not what they want to do, like, no, I just want to stay in my little hole and do my accounting spreadsheets, and there's nothing else that I want to do. Usually they are excited by getting to open their mind up, and it's like traveling. You get to see a new side of the world. And it's really beneficial for them to understand the company as a whole too, like what you're saying about whether it's that you're not spending enough or you're overspending. What you're really thinking about is what's the best use of our resources,
Yeah.
right? Like, and are we creating a product that people like, and or that the new truck shows up, it's a much better impression than the old clunker that we're
Yes,
like, exporting a Monet with. I'm just joking, but
you're absolutely right. I,
like
I have to
yeah.
say, just to kind of put a real life
Yeah.
um, affirmation to what all the stuff you just said. It's like, it is such a privilege for me to see people who, like, they're a little nervous, they don't want to do this, and oh no, well, maybe you could sit on this committee, right? And
Yeah.
then,
Yeah.
okay, cool, like, okay, now you're sitting on the committee, and now, oh, how about you want to present to the full membership? Oh, I can't speak in front of you. Yeah, you can do it.
Yeah.
And then you see these people, like, now they're speaking in front of all the owners, they're reporting on what the committee's doing. It's freaking awesome, actually, because you can see that they're growing and they are doing something that's not bookkeeping or driving or whatever the thing is. And that is actually one of the huge benefits of this. Sometimes we talk about how it's less efficient or whatever, because so many people have their hands in the soup, but it's worth it. The benefits are palpable, you know, and it's human. It's humans feeling better. That's what else can you ask for?
Yeah, and I'm not going to say anything else. I think you just really kind of summed it up. I just want to thank everybody for joining us. This has been a pleasure to have this conversation with the two of you. I think we could have gone a lot longer. But for all of you that joined us, I really appreciate that. We will be sending you a link, a follow-up email with our ebook and a link to this recording. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, this
Yeah,
was fun.
good to
Thanks
see
all.
you.